So, what would you think if you saw your neighbor walking up and down his driveway in mid-July with one of these? What would you think about your neighbor? He's a little crazy. You might be tempted to call somebody and have them go check in on him, right? Why? Not because it's a crazy thing to walk up and down your driveway with a snow shovel. We were just doing it a week or two ago, right? But it's crazy to do it if you live in eastern Pennsylvania and it's the middle of July, because there's never any snow in PA in the middle of July covering your driveway. We all understand that certain actions or responses are appropriate within certain contexts. And yet, most of us struggle with understanding and acting in accordance with the season that we've been given. As we go through life, we go through different seasons. Some seasons where you got to get out the snow shovel, metaphorically. And some seasons where it's inappropriate to get out the snow shovel. And we don't always correctly read the season we're in and respond appropriately. And that's what our passage today seeks to shed some godly wisdom upon. In our study of Ecclesiastes so far, we've seen how the things of this world will never bring ultimate fulfillment and eternal meaning to our lives like we desire. And so everything under the sun is that Hebrew word hevel, which means a breath, a smoke, a vapor. Translations put it in words like vanity or futile, meaningless. We saw how Solomon, the writer of Ecclesiastes, I'm arguing, is the wisest man who ever lived, and he arrived at this conclusion by carefully studying all that this world had to offer. He applied his great wisdom to study the different pleasures of this world, and he still reached that conclusion that it's all just a vapor. But we also saw how the proper conclusion isn't to just give up living, but rather to accept the fleeting pleasures of this life as gifts from God, not ends in and of themselves that we pursue for their own value. He's going to, today, we're seeing how Solomon presents us with 14 pairs of events that we are likely to experience in this life. Half of them are desirable things, the other half are undesirable things. And while he's going to give us some more commentary on these things in the passage we're looking at next time, verses 9 through 15, I want us to just kind of park here on Ecclesiastes 1 through 8 today and really kind of sit with the concept that he presents here, that there is a time for every matter under heaven. There is a time for everything that goes on in this world. I'm hoping that as we kind of sit with this concept a little bit here this morning, we're going to see that ups and downs are a normal part of life, and we need God's wisdom to identify and respond properly to each season that we're in. That's my goal, my hope, my prayer for today. So let's dig into, we're first going to look at this sort of what I'm calling the inescapable rhythms of life that Solomon outlines here in these verses. And then we're going to try to think through a few of the sort of implications. What does this mean for us if these things are the kinds of things that go on, and the kinds of things that we will experience in this life? Solomon begins with a summary statement in verse 1. There is a time for everything. He says, for everything there is a season and a time for every matter under heaven. Now, these terms season and time, both of those words can be used in a literal sense, like there's the season of the springtime, right? That's a season that we experience each year. Unless you live in a tropical place or whatever, then it's just one season all year round, right? But for most of us, we do experience a few different seasons throughout the year. There is time in the sense of it is, dinner time, it's a particular time of day. But these terms can also be used in a more figurative sense. We do that, don't we? We talk about a season of life. Like, I'm in a season of life right now where, well, I'm parenting a young child, or whatever. I'm in a season of life now where I'm able to travel more than I could before, or whatever. And I think that's exactly the sense in which he's using here. He's not just talking about particular points on the clock or particular dates on the calendar. He's talking in the figurative sense about how there's a time period for everything under heaven. And it's interesting here, we have to notice that Solomon is not trying to show you or me how to avoid the bad times and pursue the good times. What does he say? There is a time for everything, both the good and the bad. This is not a passage that says, here, I'm going to give you a little insider tip on how to make sure that you never have to experience the time of uprooting, that you never have to experience a time of tearing, or a time of war, or a time of refraining from embracing. What he's doing is just laying out for us all those different things that go on in our lives. It's not an accident. There's a purpose, there's a reason, and although we might not always be able to wrap our heads around that reason, those times are there for a reason. There is a time for every matter under heaven. He's stating the reality that we are going to experience many different things in this world, in this life, both good and bad. And so then he starts to give some examples in verses 2 through 8. And it's very rhythmic, very poetic, back and forth, a time for this, a time for that, a time for this, a time for that. He's going to use that term time 28 times in these 7 verses, verses 2 through 8. So definitely the clear theme here is he's talking about these different times, these different seasons that we experience in life. He talks about, in verse 2, a time to be born and a time to die. Most people are glad to celebrate their child's birth, right? How many are willing to accept a loved one's death? We love to see that time of birth, but not always that time of death. And yet both are realities in this life, in this world. He says there's a time to plant and a time to pluck up what is planted, a time for planting and a time for uprooting. It kind of harkens back to other things that Solomon wrote, like in Proverbs 20, when he said, the sluggard does not plow in the autumn, and he will seek at harvest and have nothing. He's saying, that if you don't plow the earth and do your planting at the time when the time is right, then when the other time comes, when you're supposed to be harvesting the stuff and eating it, you're going to have nothing to harvest. You can't go ahead and start then and plant because the seeds aren't going to survive the winter, or the ground won't be right. So there's a time for planting, and then there's a time for uprooting. At the same time, if you're diligent with the time of planting, but then you never uproot, if you never tear those carrots out of the ground, you got the same result, right? You've got nothing to eat. So you have to attend to both times, a time for planting and a time for uprooting. Verse 3 talks about a time to kill and a time to heal. This is not necessarily saying that all killing is justified. I mean, the 6th commandment of the 10 Commandments says you shall not murder, right? And by the way, that is a different word in the Hebrew, unlawful killing and murdering, versus the more general term for killing here, which doesn't just refer to murdering. So he's not just saying, hey, it's open season, kill whoever you want to kill, it's all good. No, he's saying there is a time for the taking of life, and there is a time for the healing, the mending of that life. Working at Hatfield meatpacking puts you in a very different season or time than if you then go and work at a veterinarian's office, right? There's a time for each kind of activity. Verse 3 goes on to say a time to break down and a time to build up. Earlier this past year, the deacons approved some new doors on the parsonage because the doors were pretty drafty, and it was a wonderful blessing. And Rob King came over to install the door on our back, but he didn't just put up a new door, right? When I say to people, oh yeah, Rob put a new door on the parsonage, I would hope most people understand that I don't just mean he came up, stuck a door up against our other door, and nailed it in place, right? What had to happen first? Actually, the part that took the longest, tearing out the old door. And he was like trying to salvage some wood from it, and a bunch of stuff got broken that he couldn't salvage. It's like there's a tearing down that has to happen before that new door can be put up. So there is a time for tearing down, and there is also a time for building up. The verse goes on to talk about a time to weep and a time to laugh, a time to mourn and a time to dance. I think that the first and second part of verse 4 are kind of circling around a similar concept, the same kind of idea. Weeping, laughing, mourning, and dancing. Dancing associated with celebration, right? There is a time for each of these things. I love how Proverbs 25:20 has been so instructive to me in ministry, just in relating to people. Whoever sings songs to a heavy heart is like one who takes off a garment on a cold day. It's so painful to see someone you love in pain, right? When you care about someone, you want to make them feel better. But the problem is, if it's not yet time to stop weeping and start laughing, if they're in a time of mourning, you're actually doing more harm than good by trying to tell them jokes or sing songs or, hey, come on, lighten up a little bit. When Ellie and I first got married, I was listening to a lot more of the old jazzy kind of standards, of Frank Sinatra and Tony Bennett and all those kind of guys. And the one song that I would sing to Ellie because it got under her skin, she had I'm blanking on the degrees, a counseling degree and social work degree. So she was much better acquainted with the darker side of life than I was. And I would sing to her that song. I don't know who all sung it, but I had the Tony Bennett version. Gray skies are gonna clear up, put on a happy face. Kick off your fears and cheer up, put on a happy face. That is like the worst song you could possibly sing to someone who actually is experiencing gray skies, right? That is just, it's not the time. There is a time for celebrating and putting on a happy face, but if it's just a mask to make other people happy when you're actually in a time of mourning, that's not right. There is a time for weeping, for mourning. Don't sing songs to a heavy heart. Verse 5 says there's a time to cast away stones and a time to gather stones. Now, this commentators have recognized that this is a pretty difficult passage to interpret, in the sense that the literal words are, casting away stones and gathering stones, but what is that in reference to? what's the significance of casting stones and gathering them? There's an ancient Jewish writing that took that as a euphemism for sex. So there's a time to make love and a time to refrain from that. And in that sense, it would pair up with the rest of verse 5, a time to embrace and a time to refrain from embracing. Other options are that it could refer to littering a field with stones during wartime so that nobody could plant in that field. Because one of the tactics of warfare is, you got to make sure that your enemy doesn't get a lot of food and supplies. You want your army to have all the supplies, and you don't want your enemy to have any. So then if you find your enemy's fields, you scatter stones all over them so that they can't plant and harvest crops and keep fighting. And they have to give up eventually. And then there's a time to gather stones, to clear a field of stones so that you can plant. We're not exactly sure, but here again, the point, whatever the cultural reference Solomon's making here, the point is there's a time for both of these opposites. There's both extremes going on here, and there is a time for both. He goes on to say, and I already referenced the second half of verse 5, a time to embrace and a time to refrain from embracing. Not all relationships must be built into at all times. Right? I've had this conversation with different friends. One in particular, one friend of mine who's a young adult, and just, it's kind of like, my friendships are changing. These guys that I was super close with in high school and everything, it's like we can't hang out all the time anymore, or they don't seem to want to hang out all the time anymore, and they're doing other things, and it's like it's a painful change in that season of life. I've tried to help them to understand, friendships are going to look different in different seasons of life. There are going to be times where you can't be hanging out all the time, where you do need to refrain from embracing. There are times, take it even further, not the same example, but a different kind of example, where you've had a friendship, you've had some level of relationship with somebody that relationship turned abusive. And there may need to be a time of separating, of setting healthy boundaries to refrain from embracing. There are different seasons, even in terms of relationship. Verse 6 talks about a time to, I'm getting behind here on my slide. Sorry about that. There's a time to seek and a time to lose, a time to keep and a time to cast away. The one commentator I was reading on this, he summarizes all of verse 6 with the simple phrase, nothing in this world is ours forever. Nothing in this world is ours forever. There's going to be times when you seek something, but then there's other times where you just count it as lost. You let go. There's going to be times to hang on to what you have as good gifts, but then there's a time to get rid of them. And some of you know the pain of trying to get rid of things that have meant a lot to you over the years. Maybe it's not even something that meant a lot to you over the years. Maybe it's just something that I could probably use that someday. And someone close to you is saying, get rid of it. There is a time to get rid of it. And maybe God is speaking through that person close to you and letting you know that it's time. Verse 7 says there's a time to tear and a time to sow. It could be, again, a reference to mourning. In that culture, the people would mourn by tearing their clothes to show visibly that they're in mourning. And just as there's a time to tear those things, there's a time to sew back together. There's a time in the second half of verse 7, a time to keep silent and a time to speak. Again, this could have overtones of mourning, this idea of sitting in silence in your mourning or crying out. There were, you might remember the story of Jesus visiting his friends Mary and Martha, whose brother Lazarus had died, and the mourners are crying. They're like professional mourners that were hired to come and cry out and all this kind of thing. So there's a time for each. But I think that this idea of speaking and keeping silent goes beyond just the concept of mourning. There are other contexts in life in which we need to speak up, or we need to speak less. There's one of Ellie's and my favorite music artists is Cody Fry. He has this song called Learn a Little More. I think that's the name of the title of it. And the one line in there, he says, I've never listened too much, but there's many times I wished I hadn't spoken. He's getting at this idea that there's a time to keep silent. And when you don't read the time correctly, it can be a problem. On the other hand, what would have happened if people like Martin Luther King Jr. had never spoken up? There's a time to speak up, isn't there? So this is not saying, hey, just keep your mouth shut no matter what. Neither is it saying, you always have the right to voice your opinions. We need godly wisdom to discern the time and to respond appropriately. Verse 8 says there's a time to love and there's a time to hate. Well, now wait a minute. Didn't Jesus say, love your enemies and pray for those who spitefully use you, or pray for those who persecute you? I had referenced Zach Eswine's book before a couple weeks ago, Recovering Eden, the Gospel According to Ecclesiastes. I really like the way that he kind of summarizes the thought going on here. We read the news. We bury our children. Murders, thefts, bribes, fists, weapons, sex, lies, and the weather patterns are used to brutalize people. We watch the raping world. We hate that what God created good has become like a rusty nailed playground no longer fit for kids at play and cutting the skin of those who try. We hate this. The wise cannot pretend that all is well. So when Solomon teaches us that there is a time to hate, Ecclesiastes 3:8, he means that it is right and good to cultivate a distaste for the misery, the sin, the death, the evil, and the havoc with which each of these ravages us. The preacher could join the psalmist in song, "O you who love the Lord, hate evil." That's Psalm 97:10. I think that's what he's getting at here when he talks about a time to hate and a time to love. We are not called to love everything of this world. We are called to love people sacrificially. We are called to love even our enemies. But there are things in which it is wise and godly to grieve and to hate in this world, in this life. And if that's happening on a personal level, there's also a time for these kinds of things to happen on a more national scale. That's what he ends with there in verse 8, a time for war and a time for peace. So I think the first part of verse 8 is more about kind of our personal scale, loving and hating. The second half is more on a national scale. One nation going to war with another time having peace with one another. There's a time for each, Solomon says. And if Solomon's point here is to to list a bunch of good and bad things that we experience in this life, not shying away from either one, but just presenting them as normal, even necessary parts of what it means to live in a broken world. Well, what should that do to us? What are the implications that we need to take home? I think there's at least 3 things that we need to take from this that I want to mention here. First of all, we need to recognize the time that we are in. And that, that can certainly mean recognizing the time that you're born into. You didn't choose when in human history to be born, right? And so you need to respond to, okay, I'm here in this time, in this place, with the opportunities presented to me that would not have been presented to me in a different time and place. So that's part of what I mean here, but I also mean you as an individual, whatever time of life you are in, you need to discern, okay, what is this time for? Some of us are prone to deny the bad stuff in life. It's like that put on a happy face song, right? We just want to, all we want to know is, okay, Bible, tell me how I can avoid the time of breaking down and just pursue the time of building up, right? But the Bible says, no. You need to learn how to walk faithfully with God, trusting Him in the time of breaking down too. Because that time is going to hit you. No matter how powerful or wealthy or successful you are, you will experience both times. And so you need to discern, what time am I in? Some of us might be tempted to kind of swing too far the other way, where we might be prone to deny that there is any good in life. Life's a pain in the neck and then you die. But this passage says, no, that's only half the story. There is a time to weep, but there's also a time to laugh. Neither outlook, neither extreme does justice to the life we've been given. So pay attention. Maybe you're in a time of rejoicing, and you need to rejoice. You need to be thankful to God for all the things He's given you to rejoice in. I'm guessing for most of us, it's hard to discern this because our times are such a mixed bag, right? It's like, well, when I got up this morning, I was in one kind of time. And by the time I ended the day, it felt like I was in a different time, right? Woke up in a time of rejoicing, and I ended the day in a time of weeping. And that's true. This is not necessarily just like, okay, for the next 3 months, I'm going to be in the time to kill. And then, for the following 3 months, I'll be in a time to heal. That's not the way it works. We need God's wisdom to discern what's going on. We need that walk of faith that goes day by day, moment by moment, right? So recognizing the time we're in then leads to properly responding to that time, right? Or at least it should. Respond properly as God gives you insight into what kind of season He has you in right now. Then look for His wisdom to respond properly to that season. Don't let Satan tell you that you're useless to God's kingdom because you're stuck at home with small children, or because you're stuck in a nursing home, or like you have limited mobility. You're not able to do all the things. You've got freedoms that are being taken away from you. Don't let Satan tell you that there's something wrong with you, or that God is punishing you, or whatever else. It's a different time. There's a different season. And our response within each season needs to be appropriate to that season. And recognizing and responding to that time doesn't just apply for how I look at my own life. It should apply for how we look at those around us. We're meant to live in community and to respond appropriately to the seasons of others, right? That's what was talked about with that proverb that says if you sing songs to a heavy heart, it's like you're just taking away their coat in the dead of winter. We need to not just respond to the time that I'm in, but whenever I get the chance to interact with somebody else, I need to be attentive to what's going on in their mood, in their life, and respond appropriately. And obviously, or at least I hope it's obvious, we need God's empowering for all of this. This is not something where I just say, okay, I'm going to try harder. I need God's Spirit to work in me. Jesus said, apart from me, you can do nothing. John 15:5. James, in James 1:5, said, if anyone lacks wisdom, let him ask of God, who gives to all generously without reproach, and it will be given to him. So if you need that wisdom to understand your own time or the time of someone else, you need that wisdom to respond appropriately to that time, ask God. He longs to give us, to teach us his wisdom. I want to read another quote here from Zach. He's been, in the chapter, he was talking about how, we need to respond in one way at one point and a different way at another point. And he says, at this moment, some of you are ready to shout, but how do we know when to do one and not the other? The question is the first step away from formulaic or trite answers to make life naively manageable and toward the humility of recognizing that we will need God for each moment instead of a forced rule on which we must found our trust. Humbled, we are meant to look to God to teach us what we ourselves do not yet have the wisdom to apply to our relationships. Eswine is saying there, and I think it's what Solomon is saying here, in just presenting these things to us, there's no formula. It's not a formula. Here's how to decipher the time for this and the time for that. All Solomon is saying is there is a time for each. So the implication is I need to lean on the Lord constantly to understand what that time is and to understand how to respond. Only a closer walk with our Lord will do. My hope is not built upon my own ability to read the times. My hope is not built upon some secret code that I deciphered here and how to read the times. My hope is built on him, my relationship to him, and the wisdom and guidance that he gives me as I take step after step of faith. We walk by faith and not by sight. That's what the Bible says, right? It doesn't say we made a decision of faith and then we walk however we can, the best we can. No, we make a decision of faith when we trust Christ for the first time, but then we walk step by step by step, also by faith. So with these things in mind, I want to send us home with 3 points of homework, which basically go along very much with what I just talked about. First of all, seek God's wisdom to understand the time he has you in. Maybe you are in a season of planting. Maybe you're planting gospel seeds without seeing any harvest. And you're frustrated because you keep planting and planting and planting those seeds and no one's turning to Christ. Are you going to be faithful to the season that God has you in right now? Maybe you're in a season of uprooting from people or places that you used to call home, and it's unsettling. Can you trust God in that season of uprooting? Maybe you're in a season of rejoicing in and enjoying successes at work or a new baby in the family or whatever. Rejoice. Give thanks to God. Maybe you're in a season of mourning of a loved one, the loss of a loved one. There's nothing wrong with you if you're mourning the loss of a loved one. You're not somehow made more sinful or like you don't have enough faith. You're in a season of mourning. And God is there too. He's with you. Maybe you're in a season of deepening a friendship or a relationship. Maybe you're in an opposite season of setting boundaries on a friendship or relationship that isn't God-honoring or that is taking up all of your energy and leaving you drained and unable to invest in others as God is calling you to do. Maybe you're in a season of stepping out in faith in bold new ventures. And it's a fearful thing. It's scary to step out into the unknown. Maybe you're in a season of experiencing more and more limitations, physically, mentally, whatever. Maybe God has you in a season where you need to hold your tongue and listen more to those that you don't agree with. Maybe He has you in a season where you need to speak up for the cause of truth and justice. I'm not going to give you a formula. Run to Him. Run to the Lord. Say, God, show me. Show me the season that you have me in. And then give me the power that I need to respond rightly. Will you fight the season that God is bringing you through? Are you going to always try to avoid one time and cling to another? Or will you submit to God's plan, trusting that He is with you through the ups and the downs? Maybe you need to embrace celebration of a good season and stop worrying about what the next season might bring. It's possible to not hang on to a good season, right? Because you're always so worried about what might be around the corner. And then finally, I would urge us to do these things corporately, to practice these things corporately. Don't just ask God to help you interpret your own time, but also the time of those around you so that you can respond properly to them. You want to be like one who puts on the cloak on a cold day, not the one who takes it off. We need God's help to respond rightly to the seasons of others around us. We need to keep learning how to do what Romans 12:15 says, where it says, rejoice with those who rejoice and weep with those who weep. Not to say, hey, you're having a little too much fun over here. Let's bring it down a few pegs. Or, hey, you're a little too sad over here. Come on, cheer up. It's not your job to bring everybody into alignment with how you're feeling. Job's friends made the mistake of misreading the time for their philosophical debate for him, right? If you have read the story of Job, he had these friends that came and sat with him for a week in silence and mourning, and they were there for him, and it was wonderful. But then they thought, you know what? I think it's time. Job, you're a sinner. And that's why you're going through all this pain. And if you hadn't done something really bad, God wouldn't have sent all this terrible stuff to afflict you. And that's where all the trouble starts. They read the time correctly for the first week. But something happened. And we can learn from that account. By God's grace, we can accept and respond to the fact that there is a time for everything. And that our God is present and working in all of it. Amen? Let me pray for us. Father, I pray that you would help us, enable us to discern the seasons that you have us in. Enable us, Father, to discern and respond appropriately to the seasons of those around us, being the body of Christ that you've called us to be. Enable us, Lord, to do all of those one another